lately. I do think, however, that it is still an extremely competitive continent for inbound investment, and one that has become more so in recent years. And we've seen the other countries kind of replicate the approach of China or try to increase investment towards the continent, and also try to increase development finance. So I don't think we're looking at a complete turn away from this, but you are probably expecting a couple tougher years when it comes to generally development and infrastructure lending there.
Great. So Alex, hoping you're still there, we'll take another round of questions from you.
Perfect. I was just about to jump in, so glad. Yeah, we've had lots actually, which is fantastic, and which is great. Vincent, funnily enough, I know you mentioned fake news. The UK government announced today, well, that it was granting some money to combating fake news about Corona. So glad to see that, yeah, that they're responding. We've had a couple of questions which touch on the same topic, so I'm going to roll these into one. You will have, I'm sure the four of you are aware that the news today that Uganda has stopped incoming flights. And so a couple of our audience have asked around, will we be seeing the same shutdown that many other countries have been experiencing? You know, case in point, are Italy, China, and the news today around Ireland. Will we be seeing these same shutdowns, and will this then be affecting, you know, the newly ratified African Continental Free Trade Agreement? What are the implications on that intra-Africa trade and for Africa travel?
Great. So Vincent, do you want to take that question on the impact on flights?
Yes, I think you know, we're really seeing in the last maybe 7 days the response of these governments stepping up, and their logic is still that of containment and kind of prevention of you know, preventing the virus from getting to their countries. So perhaps an earlier stage than some of the European countries that are already more in a delay phase of their response. So far, or the initial measure, as I mentioned, was suspending flights to China, because that was seen as the source of the epidemic. Then the next steps that most countries have taken have mostly been around controls for incoming travelers. And so you do have you know, many countries that now have temperature testing requirements for forms, enhanced screening, and for those that have an elevated profile, depending on symptoms or depending on where they're coming from, a requirement to self-isolate. Some countries have gone so far as to establish isolation centers in their capital cities to basically make sure that the people that are coming in and that show symptoms are appropriately quarantined, which I think for many international inbound travelers will be you know, a key consideration to make. Are you exposing your people going on business visits, for example, to be held for 14 days in a medical facility in the capital city of a country that you were planning to visit only for a few days? At the moment, we haven't seen that many you know, complete flight suspensions, but there are countries that are talking about it. And then the same way that you know, borders so far by and large remain open, but we have seen a few what I would perhaps characterize as pretty knee-jerk reactions of certain governments to shut down their borders to personnel movements. As an example, Cameroon reported 2 cases of coronavirus a few days ago, and Chad almost immediately declared that there wouldn't be no more people crossing the border between the 2 countries. It will really depend on how the epidemic progresses, but I think there is a bit of a copycat effect where if some of these, especially the leading economies in the continent, start having flight suspensions with Europe and border shutdowns, then the others will most likely follow to have a bit of a coherent approach.
Arshad, maybe you could tackle the one on the Africa Free Trade Zone and impacts on intra-African trade.
So I think that's quite interesting. I mean, the Africa Free Trade Agreement has taken a long time to come into effect, and I think there's still a lot of work to be done before it gets fully materialized. I do think that as the COVID-19 develops in Africa, I think the response will be rather of containment and protection of people within the country. So I think the view will be that we know that if it can get into our populace, because of our underdevelopment on health, it could have a larger impact. So I do believe that the focus will be on health to lockdown and will have a further impact on free trade agreement. I think African economies sit in a very difficult situation because on the one side, government intervention will have a significant impact on GDP growth and maintaining confidence in the economy. So balancing the economic effect and balancing the health effect of containing the virus, of not becoming a epidemic or pandemic in their own countries will be a challenge many African countries will face going forward. It's just very difficult right now to call how they'll react because it really has a huge impact both from a health perspective and an economic perspective.
Great. David, did you want to tackle one of them?
You tell me what you want me to tackle.
Well, we could get another question, Alex, if you have some more.
Yeah, I think definitely. I think time for one more question. So this is, we've mentioned lots, well, at the beginning of this webinar around oil and the effect that this is going to have on the future. We've had a question regarding this, you know, that given the fact that the price of oil is more than likely not going to be able to stabilize by the end of Q2, are you in agreement, all of you, I suppose, that a Nigerian devaluation is likely?
Yes.
There we are.
David.
That's the webinar, I suppose. No. Any elaboration?
Look, so if you look at the devaluations of hydrocarbon currencies, and you see the same in Saudi Arabia and Russia and any of their hallmark is whenever, if they've lost 50% of their production or 50% of their revenues at a fixed production, they will try and compensate through their currency. The problem they've got is essentially they start that process, and if they have any dollarized debt within their economy, they become super susceptible to the dollarized debt blowing them up. And so there are limitations on how you structure such a definancing. It'll naturally happen because the market will realize the countries are obviously losing their balances completely raw financially to support their economies. So this currency will start to move. And then if they can accelerate it, before they know it, they could accelerate themselves into a problem where significant dollar debt actually makes them a bankrupt country. So there's a limitation on that strategy.
Arshad?
I do agree with David. I think we will see a devaluation coming. So I think where they are, I think we have to understand, even before the price shocks on oil, there were significant concerns on Nigeria in terms of their oil revenue and being able to maintain their revenue levels.
And Vincent, maybe you can speak to the Ghanaian case too.
Yes, I think Ghana tends to be a lot less affected by the shock of the oil price. The economy is by far much less dependent on oil revenue. Just to go back on Nigeria, I think what's important to remember is that compared to 2008, where a global financial crisis hit, the buffers are nowhere near what they used to be. We're now around $36 billion in forex reserves, and the CBN had indicated that they would consider devaluation if the reserves were to go under 30. It now looks like we will hit that 30 threshold, probably in the next 4 to 6 months. And I think most analysts would expect that you'd have a devaluation coming around, Q3 of 2020, possibly slightly earlier, if the oil price remains at where it is currently.
Fantastic. Alex, any more questions, or shall we give the panelists a last word?
Yes, I think we've got a couple of minutes now, so I think just sort of last comments from all of you, and then we can wrap it up.
Great. So maybe in your final comments, you can speak to some of the longer term impacts that we're going to see both on the continent and in the sort of the global economic system. Why don't you kick us off, David?
Okay, so I do see this next 12 months as being akin to a 1929 type phase for the American economy, but this is for the global economy. Africa's problem is twofold. One is its revenue base, which was commodity-led on the whole, stalling. The other is the virus and social cohesion through that process. And the third is that the main investors in Africa, as in the other countries, are so occupied with their own survival and trying to get themselves back to work that, in fact, Africa is led more than we've seen to its own devices from the West. But China understands the ability to jump in and exert more influence, whether they're defaulted loans or new loans. So I think it lays Africa open to China in a way that's very concerning. And the countries that will fare best are those governments who are have a number of qualities. One is their ability to genuinely organize their people effectively. And I think in that regard, South Africa is strongly positioned. But those governments which are perceived to be dishonest and kleptocracies actually are very exposed to social change because there won't be enough to go around, and the politicians will really become the targets because they will have skimmed off the top large portions. So I'd watch for social change in those environments.
Arshad?
I think the first point I would start off with is that I believe that the larger economies are very much internally focused to deal with the COVID-19 on their side, and other matters like trade wars that are happening. So I think that will have a huge impact on Africa. I think it's important to note that as Africa, we haven't really understood or seen the full impact of COVID-19. We have vulnerabilities with HIV, AIDS, TB within the populace and highly informal segments of the market that will define, if it gets into this market, what the impacts could be. I believe that economies that are highly diverse will be resilient through the process, but how we react as a continent to contain the virus will be quite important in terms of defining how we go forward. I think the last thing is I believe that what this has shown is the dependence of Africa on China and the influence of Africa on China. So as the way China comes out of this pandemic, are they able to restart the economy? Can they create stimulus? Will have a huge impact. And that needs to be watched closely in terms of specifically sub-Saharan Africa and effectively its future and growth over the next 2 to 3 years.
Fantastic. And Vincent?
Yes, I wanted to finish with perhaps more of a note on risk management as organizations who may be listening and wondering what do we do with this. In a way, because the virus has hit with a lag in Africa, and because the next few weeks might probably see an increase in cases, I would say that now is the time really to think about how do you retain resilience in your business. How do you make sure you have business continuity for a situation that is likely to get worse? There's a lot of lessons that we can learn already from the experience of Asia and now of European countries. A lot of the companies that are operating on the continent will already have the experience because many of them are linked to global supply chains and obviously working as part of global organizations. But there's a couple of considerations to make. One, I think, is considering that the conditions for working remotely in many of those countries, for many of staff of those organizations, might not be ideal and might not be as good as what you can have in Europe, for example. So that is one thing that organizations should bear in mind when they're thinking about their business continuity planning. Another that actually has come up in a lot of our conversations with clients is around how do you maintain information security at a time where you are sending your people home, having them work on public Wi-Fi or far less well-protected Wi-Fi. These are considerations I think that many organizations that are primarily focused on Africa that haven't yet been hit at a global level by this situation should already be considering, because it will most likely come to affect them in the next few weeks.
That's all for this week. Thanks again to Invest Africa and all the panel. For more on the impact of coronavirus, do be sure to check the website, www